It is something of an international tit for tat, as China is now sanctioning 3 congressional Republicans, the U.S. ambassador at large of international religious freedom, that is Sam Brownback, as well as the Congressional Executive Commission on China. And all this is in response to the U.S. sanctioning Chinese officials over the mass detention, suppression, and enslavement of ethnically Uyghur Muslims in the western part of China. So we're joined to talk about this, put it in some context, by Dean Cheng, from the Heritage Foundation, where he's research fellow on Chinese political and security affairs. So let's try to go in order here. Dean, first of all, the Chinese going after well-known American politicians, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz among them. Any impact there?
Not directly, in all likelihood. It's unlikely that either of the senators was planning on visiting China anytime soon. Certainly, they're unlikely to do so now. Similarly, the Chinese officials who are running Xinjiang were unlikely to come to the United States. What is more concerning is the 2 potential issues. One is, could staffers for these senators, congressmen, the ambassador, or from the commission potentially find themselves in trouble if they were to, say, transit through Hong Kong? The other is the possibility that the Chinese will persuade some of their partners, for example, Belt and Road Initiative aid recipients, to potentially act if the senators, the ambassador, or their staff were to transit through those countries. That could really create some very awkward situations.
What about the issue of the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in China to begin with, as more broadly? Because when we were negotiating a trade agreement with the Chinese, it didn't seem like there was much mention of that issue from the Trump administration. But now that first part of the trade agreement is done, there is. What do you make of that, and what does it say about the future of just of relations between the U.S. and China?
Well, if you look at the history of U.S. relations with a number of authoritarian systems, the Soviet Union back in the days of the Cold War, our relations with China, there's always been multiple tracks of negotiations. We negotiated nuclear arms control deals with the Soviets, but at the same time, we criticized them heavily for their treatment of their own people. Jackson Vanik basically said that if you prohibit the Russian Jewish population from emigration, you would be facing sanctions. The same sort of situation applies here. We have trade issues with the Chinese. We have environmental issues with the Chinese. We have human rights issues with the Chinese. So it is, in fact, possible to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah, there was criticism, or there has been, over the last couple of years of this president for not doing that effectively when it came either to the Uyghur issue or to business issues. Huawei, for example. I don't know if you saw in the UK now, Boris Johnson, the prime minister, calling for a ban on Huawei being used in 5G networks. So is that changing as well, where maybe the administration might not view an attack on Huawei, or however you want to phrase it, as something that's going to, quote unquote, mess up trade negotiations?
Absolutely. And the funny thing is that from the Chinese perspective, all of this is seen as pretty well coordinated. I think the Chinese absolutely believe that our criticism of their human rights record is arguably to gain leverage over trade issues. And trade criticism is sometimes masked as a strategic issue. So there definitely is a certain degree of them thinking that we are more coordinated than we are. And at the same time, we ourselves sometimes not being as coordinated as we should be.
But is trade, U.S. trade talks, like a second phase, it seems like from what the president said late last week, is that done for now? It seems like it is. What do you think?
We're, 4 months out from the election? It's very hard to imagine that we could have any kind of a trade deal negotiated before November. The Chinese themselves have every reason to wait and see. They may think that post-November, they'll have a chance to cut a different deal, maybe even a better deal, depending on who wins. I think that, and on our side, everyone's about to head, straight into the election fever. So I'm not sure how much attention span there's going to be for negotiating phase 2.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. All right, good to see you again, Dean. Thank you. Dean Cheng from Heritage. Melissa?